with the NACD Northern California chapter. It's really my pleasure to add my welcome to all of you today for this session on culture. I've been really excited about this topic for quite a while because of just how important I think it is. You know, forever we've heard that trite phrase that, you know, people are our greatest assets, but I suspect culture may be an organization's greatest asset, and a bad culture may be the most destructive force in an organization. And that's why we love to see the best places to work lists every year. I know in Sacramento, VSP and nugget stores are always at the top of the list. You know, completely different types of organizations, but they're both doing it the right way. And that allows them to do a good job and attract the best employees as well, regardless of what pay looks like. So Lisa alluded to it, but my day job, I lead the Red Cross for most of Northern California. And you know, we're obviously a humanitarian services organization, but we hold our teammates responsible and measure performance, not only on objective goals, but also on a series of values that we call the 5 C's: collaboration, compassion, creativity, credibility, and being committed. So right now, as you can imagine, we are deep into what has been a horrendous fire season. For over 2 months straight, we've been responding to wildfires in Northern California, and we expect to be sheltering people for weeks, if not months to come. You know, it's been really tough to see the loss of forest land, homes, and most importantly, the loss of lives. But what has been most gratifying to me is the culture that permeates our response. There's absolute clarity that safety of the workforce is our first priority, and we have dedicated resources that are in place to keep an eye on that and make sure that we're doing things in a safe way. And when we meet and have an all-staff stand-up at the end of every day during these disasters, we wrap up with what we call shout-outs, both formal and spontaneous. And these are where people share stories about the extraordinary things that they have seen their coworkers do over the course of the day. Really builds camaraderie and good teamwork. So this is really about boards. So let's get into what I hope will be a dynamic discussion led by Jenny Chatman and Jennifer Cook about the board of directors' role in company culture. So over to you, Jenny. Who may be still on mute.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Gary. What a pleasure to see you all. I see some familiar faces in the group here, some of my board colleagues. I'm a professor at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. I'm our Associate Dean for Learning Strategies. I'm also on the board of Simpson Manufacturing, which is a Bay Area company. And I love having multiple roles in that way because it really informs my research, which focuses on leveraging culture for strategic success. So what Jennifer and I thought we would do is, why don't I actually lay that out, and then I'm going to have Jennifer introduce herself. Jennifer is actually a former student of mine. We're not going to tell you which year because it would age us both. But if you do learn the year, she was 2 at the time and I was 4, so all good. But Jennifer has been a magnificent leader that I've tracked for a very long time, and has been an incredible leader of culture. And she's actually invested in and leveraged culture in, I think, all of the jobs that she's had. And she's moved up and up into higher and higher roles and larger organizations, and more success through leveraging culture. So she has an incredible amount of experience, and she's also a board member now. What I think we'll talk about, and then I'll let her introduce herself, is we're going to start by just offering some definitions. I think culture is one of those topics that people think is really sort of obvious, and I think it's important for us to have a conversation about it to really be precise in defining what we're talking about. So we're going to talk about what it is, what the criteria for using culture as a strategic tool are, and kind of lay that groundwork, and then go into the issue of what a board's responsibility is and what vantage point they have for thinking about organizational culture. We have some poll questions along the way just to keep it interesting. And Jennifer and I are both really, really interested in your questions and your experiences. I think neither of us want to spend a lot of time talking. We would rather interact if we can. So let me turn it over to Jennifer to introduce herself, and then we'll launch.
Thanks, Jenny. That was very kind. It's always very humbling to listen to an introduction like that, but I do appreciate it. We did meet a long time ago. My career spans a number of years. I started it's actually about 30 some years in biotech and pharma, pretty much exclusively. I started out on the research and early development side, working in a lab, but then about 10 years later transitioned through my MBA onto the commercial side, and held a number of positions over the years in commercial, global, and strategy roles at Genentech, and then Roche, once Roche acquired Genentech. I also, once leaving that world, took on a role as the CEO of gaylecrowell, which is a company developing a blood-based test for early detection of cancer. And then most recently, I've joined a couple of boards, BridgeBio and Denali, and get to then sit on the other side of the table from, and still support management teams through advisory work that I do. So it's given me a number of opportunities, as Jenny mentioned, to deploy what I learned so well from her in business school about the applications of culture. And I have to say it's been striking and looking back over about a 15-year period of just the leading teams part of my career, where we have deployed culture as a leadership tool in settings of teams with a lack of identity, teams that are working in silos, when there's been a disruption to an organization, whether through reorgs or leader changes or an external shift, everything down to organizational inertia, lack of trust, all of these things that can occur in organizations, we've been able to in some way address through culture as a catalyst to the discussion, but also as a means to really heal the organization and move it on together. So I look forward to being able to talk through some of those examples if you have questions, and of course, from some of your own experiences in those settings as well.
Great. So let me just kick us off by offering a kind of concrete definition of culture and the criteria for using culture as a leadership tool. So culture is really about shared expectations about what should happen in a particular setting. And one thing that's true about culture is, some people say, well, this organization has no culture. Well, that's actually not true. All organizations have culture. Some are good, some are bad, some are helpful, some are not helpful. And so it turns out that you don't really have a choice about whether a culture forms in an organization. Anytime you have people coming together on a regular basis where they're interacting and things like their job responsibilities and their status in the organization are at stake, cultural norms will form, patterns of behaviors and expectations will form. So you don't have a choice over that. What you do have a choice over is, what is the nature of that culture? How strong is it? How aligned with your strategy is it? How adaptive is it over time? And in fact, those are the three criteria that we think about for an effective culture. An effective culture is one that prioritizes the most important strategic behaviors for your organization. So for example, the reason why everybody talks about Southwest Airlines when they talk about culture is because the Southwest culture is very, very closely aligned with their business strategy. As just one example, they turn the planes in 20 minutes versus the industry average of 45 minutes. With a low-cost model, that's a really important practice for people to be engaged in. And what it requires is a level of teamwork that the other airlines are unable to attain. And this happens at Southwest, even though 90% of employees are members of a labor union. So this is a cultural phenomenon within Southwest. Prioritizing turn time is something that that's vitally important to their strategy. So you could say that Southwest culture is strategically aligned, and that's very, very valuable. A second criterion is that the culture is strong, and we mean by that that people both agree about what's important and there's intensity around it. They're willing to sort of back it up with action. People are rewarded for upholding the culture, and there are consequences for a failure to uphold the culture. And the third criterion is that the culture is adaptive over time. And one of the things that we're seeing, I'm doing extensive research in the COVID environment right now. And one of the things that we're seeing is, I actually wrote a case about Jennifer when she ran a major division of Genentech and changed the culture in 11 months, which contributed to their ability to achieve their 5-year strategy in 11 months instead, much faster. I thought that was the fastest culture change that I'd ever seen. So I wrote a case about it, which I'm happy to share with any of you. But what we're seeing right now in the COVID environment is a really fast ability to shift the culture in significant ways. And I think that's a good thing. And I think organizations that are making those shifts, given the changing nature of the environment, are actually not only going to move in strategically relevant ways and come out stronger, they're also going to retain a capacity in the long run for recognizing their ability to change faster than they ever thought they could as a kind of meta competency. So these are the 3 criteria that we talk about: a culture that's strategically relevant, that prioritizes the behaviors that will get you across the finish line strategically; a culture that is strong, where people are celebrated for upholding the culture and have real consequences for a failure to do so; and where the culture is adaptive to the extent that the external environment changes. So let me stop there and head over to Jennifer and see what you want to add to that definition.
Yeah, I think beyond the definition too, it's which is extremely important and to be kept in mind. I think it's, as Jenny said, oftentimes people talk about culture as if it's this fuzzy thing that is very subjective, and in fact, it is something that can be measured. And coming from a company like Genentech and literally growing up there, I'm a very data-oriented person. I love data. All my jobs involve data in some intensive way until I went into general management. And to be able to actually measure something that's about human behavior and human interaction is extremely helpful, because not only can you gain a baseline understanding of where you are, you can assess where you want to go, and you can see how your progress is going along the way. And that really helps just in so many ways, but not least of which is just communication, alignment, understanding, having a shared lexicon, and a sense of, actually being able to track progress and know what's changing. So I would say that's one piece is, within the definition, is realizing that it's actually quite a measurable and manageable aspect of the business. And the other piece is that during COVID, what I have seen, and hence the subject, the title that Jenny proposed, Don't Quarantine Your Culture, is that it's also the glue. It's an aspect of the affiliation that we feel to the companies that we work in, a very, very powerful one, because it's really the source of our norms. And so it's something we look to and we measure ourselves against, and we're constantly regulating against. And when we're not physically together, that's a lot harder to do. So creating a norm around Zoom is a really different thing than existing in an office and interacting in meetings, et cetera, live. And so, losing that sense of affiliation or glue is really quite a risk, I think, to organizations right now if they're not tending to it very actively and trying to find ways to really overcompensate for the separation that we're all experiencing.
So we had a couple of poll questions. Daniela, why don't we launch one of those now? I'm interested to find out from folks how strategically relevant your culture is. And you can respond here in terms of your culture is very relevant to your strategy, extremely relevant, very relevant, moderately relevant, slightly relevant, or not at all relevant.
And presumably pick one organization if you're a member of a board of multiple ones.
A few more folks. right, and everyone should see results on their screen.
So great. So people are saying very relevant, primarily, and some are even saying extremely relevant. Can we have a couple of examples of that? And maybe if you want to tell us either whether you're talking about your board or if you're also working in another organization, which of those, which vantage point you're looking at that from? Who has a specific example of the linkage between your strategy and your culture that led you to say extremely relevant or very relevant?
You can just go ahead and unmute at this time and pop in.
So I'll just offer a little bit of insight on one of the boards I'm on. The culture is very well defined, and it's, you know, in the buildings, it's you know, posted and whatnot, but it's also discussed every year in the strategic planning, and it's also feathered throughout the management training. I mean, every aspect of the organization, there's no question about what the culture intent is and how the managers and the employees interact and all of that. So that's why I answered strategically yes. I can't say we have seen a very specific strategy to change it. We've had recent conversations about COVID and remote and whether we need to explain it differently or how we need to do things. And one thing that the CEO did that I thought was just, he does a periodic, every couple of weeks, well, every week he does a message out, but he's been doing also video, and he's making it serious and playful, like even pictures of him working from home and, you know, things going on in the background, and just trying to humanize the experience of what's happening to show that they're all coming along together, that I thought was really great. So, and I think other companies, that's one example of a board I'm on that a company that I think is doing really well. And I think there's other companies that are really struggling because they're not trying to figure that out. So it's really, really critical. Is that a good example, or is that not?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, you're describing the strength of the culture, that it sort of permeates throughout the organization. And so I think that's a terrific example. Maybe we can see if there are examples like the Southwest example of how the turn time and everybody's willingness to contribute to that, even though it's not part of their job, is so strategically relevant for Southwest. Is there a kind of a substance base? So there's the content part of culture, and there's the strength part of culture. And Kim did a great job explaining a kind of strong culture. Any of you have examples about the alignment?
I think one I would throw out, one of my public boards is a company called InvestNet, which is a financial services platform that enables advisors to effectively use data and intelligence to help create financial wellness for their clients. And when I think about that company, I think about the thought process, the behaviors, the action, the passion, all around your financial world. There's just not a conversation I don't go into, or a board meeting I don't go into, where people aren't really talking about the day-to-day implications of your financial wellness and how they bring that together in terms of from everybody from the very wealthy down to the people who have less financial assets. And it comes across in everything they do, that passion behind it, how they think of it through that lens, and how they think that will ultimately deliver quality solutions to the advisors, hence to the end user. It's an impressive culture. They're very open, very innovative. They take a lot of risk, I think, in terms of that, because you can come up with some different ideas that may not be mainstream. So it comes all together with some really great alignment with their product and with their company.
Actually, Jennifer, it reminds me when you were going through the culture shift at Geo, one of the shifts, silly for me to explain this, but it's just a small example of one of the shifts that they engaged in was it was the commercial side of a business that was selling immunologic and ophthalmologic medicine. And part of the challenge in the culture was that people were losing their sort of sense of passion around helping patients and driving innovation and exploration in service of helping patients. And so one of the shifts they made, a very small but a very significant one, was that rather than starting meetings with business, they started meetings with a patient story of how the medicines that they were making available had helped a patient. And instead of talking about how many vials they had sold, they talked about how many patients they helped. So the kind of awareness around what it is you're trying to do strategically can be effectively woven into the culture. I don't know if those examples came up for you, Jennifer, as you were listening to, I thought as Gail was talking, that's what reminded me.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, this was a recognition, what we found from the assessment we did using the organizational culture profile tool that Jenny and colleagues have developed, is that the organization felt that the emphasis on results and drive for results and intensity was so high, and it was coming at the cost of really being able to talk about and focus on patients, which is just a horrendous thing for a company whose whole core values are about patients. So to find that, we really felt like that was such a misalignment, and that was something that we could correct. So here we are, a sales and marketing organization, saying that we want to de-emphasize results. You can imagine that my boss might have felt interestingly about that if I hadn't framed it constructively, because of course it was our job to deliver revenue, and that was something that we all understood very, very well. But the point was, and this is where I think that sort of stepping back about culture in general, is it can be viewed as an add-on. Like, we don't have the luxury of that right now. That's a nice to have. We've got work to do, and then we'll pay attention to our culture. What this points out is, this one of the examples that the example Jenny just gave, is it's an example of how it's really just about how you do what you already do, and ensuring that you use every vehicle you have at your disposal. And a couple of you just listed some of these off, to continue to emphasize the aspects of the culture that are strategically important and enabling of your future success, but you're doing it through vehicles you already have. I was going to be sending an update email to the team on a very regular basis. That email always used to start with sales, and now it started with patients served. I still got the email out, but it felt really different to me in writing it, and it felt really different to the people reading it out in the field, so that they felt that their regard for their patients was really being observed and respected throughout the business. So I like that kind of example, because it's a reminder to people that this isn't it's just how you do what you already do, and doing it thoughtfully and consistently, and in a way that reinforces your strategy and ability to perform, and frankly, ability to engage people and have them feel good about their work. All of those things are a kind of virtuous cycle.
Right. Please go ahead.
Rich?
No, go finish your thought.
I was just going to say that at its best, an organizational culture ought to provide members of the organization with a roadmap to navigate, in particular, the conflicting priorities of your strategy. It ought to help people navigate through and figure out what's the most important thing to pay attention to, given the fact that there are a lot of important things to pay attention to. And so, again, I would emphasize that you don't have a choice about whether a culture will form. A culture will form. But what we see is that organizations who are more deliberate in doing the small things, as Jennifer described, or in the organization that Gail described, that really show the deliberate priorities in strategic terms of the organization, will help people make those tough decisions, judgment calls, and trade-offs at their level of the organization. It actually provides a kind of strategic insight about what's really important. So I think it's too important to leave culture to chance, and the organizations that are more deliberate about it are the ones that actually do very well. So Rich, let's hear from you.
Yeah, actually, I was going to throw out two things. One is I sometimes think, you know, if we up at the top, we lose track that there's what we want as the perceived or the desired culture, and then there's the real culture, and that I think Jennifer talks about doing that measuring to understand. I had a great conversation a couple of years ago with a Fortune 100 CEO, and I asked him about culture, and he said, I thought it was really good until we did an employee survey and realized it was a problem. And then often what happens is then you have different cultures at various levels, but the most important thing is the culture that I want is exhibited, those behaviors and those core values are exhibited at the top, because if they're not, then people go, yeah, that's our quote-unquote company culture, but that's not how we do things. And I sometimes think at the higher level we lose track of digging down and doing that. And a great example I have from a previous life of 3 fighter squadrons, exact same leadership, exact same material, exact same rules, had distinctively different cultures. One was, I'll call them the Golden Boys, that always the number one. They never did anything wrong. They were always the top performers. There's another squadron that if someone did something wrong, 99 out of 100 times it was somebody in that one. And then there was a middle one, and it took a very long time to actually turn around the underperforming group, even though everything was exactly the same. And that's because people came in that said, we're going to change the culture, but they didn't do the steps at the lower levels of the subcultures and actually change those. And when you have long-term employees or members of a unit organization, they often drive the culture, even though you think you are, because you're in charge.
Now you're calling out a really important aspect of this, which is actually asking employees what they think. And it's one of the most interesting conversations I've had in multiple settings and multiple companies, where I'm a big fan of figuring out and learning what is going on. And because I do think, I totally agree, as a senior leader, you get more and more separated from what's really happening, because people actually insulate you from it for various reasons. No matter how hard you may try, people will still, sort of create distance. And so I always want to know what's really happening out there. And I'll often get pushback that's like, well, what if something like a survey like this, I get the question, well, what if they're wrong? You're going to ask all the employees what the future culture should be. What if they're wrong? And at first I was just speechless when I heard that question, because it just made no sense to me. But I finally started to understand what people meant about that, and a fear of a lack of control, perhaps. But my answer is always, well, it's already there. So don't you want to know? I mean, you don't want to be the only one who doesn't know what's out there. And I call it my ostrich theory of management, which is if I don't know it, it's not happening. That's really not going to help anybody. So trying to really reach everyone in the organization, understand, through something like a systematic tool, which organizes that. It not only lets you learn from them, but it gives them efficacy in the change. They now have a voice, they have a role, they have defined it, they have skin in the game. And even if they never do anything actively on a working group or a team, they have gotten to weigh in, and that creates a sense of attachment, affiliation, ownership, where they actually become a part of something just by being asked. So the power of asking, I think, is truly incredible. And that, what if they're wrong, or what will we do? I got this one recently when I suggested some culture work with an organization, and they're swamped in a period of change. There's all kinds of stresses. And they basically said, well, but then we'll have to do something about it. And yet again, I was sort of stunned into silence for a moment, because I said, well, yes. I mean, yes, you will, but the issue's there whether you ask or not. So don't you want to know, is always my question.
Yeah, and actually in our research over many years, I've developed this quantitative tool for assessing the strategic relevance, the strength, the adaptability of culture, and looking specifically, Rich, at the separation between the current culture and the ideal culture if you were fully executing on your strategy. And what we do, we also do subgroup analyses on that. And one big finding is that the leadership team is always more optimistic about where the current culture is than the rest of the organization. And what that really means is that they're more informed about the strategy. And so they're describing what their aspirational culture is, but it's less likely to have cascaded down through the organization. And so that actually leads to a question that's very relevant for this group, which is, given that your main contact as a board member is with the leadership team, with very senior leaders, and given that they are going to have some systematic blind spots about the culture of their organization, what are some responsibilities for the board in terms of assessing the suitability of the culture for the strategy that the organization is pursuing? So I would just kind of leave you with that question and ask, those of you who have sought to understand how the culture cascades through the organization, what are some of the options that you have for doing that? In fact, we could pull up question 4, Daniela, if we wanted to, just for fun. Just to open this question up. How strategic, that's
Nope,
number 1.
the wrong one. One moment.
Try number 4, which should be, how involved is your board in cultivating your company's culture? Extremely involved, very involved, moderately involved, slightly involved, or not at all involved?
Jenny, to answer your question, and I know we share a lot of the same experiences sitting on the board of the same company, but attending large employee events like international sales conferences and other similar type gatherings, I have always found very helpful in understanding what's the buzz at the bottom. And I would say that is one way that's fairly easy if you have the time to educate yourself on where the business sits.
Yeah, that's a great one, Jim.
Faye had a question. I'm not sure if you also have an answer to this one, Faye, but Faye did have a question on safety and well-being. And then Janet, I know you had a comment earlier. So Faye and Janet, if you want to pop in and add into this, that would be great to hear from you.
Hello, ladies. It's a pleasure to hear this subject being addressed. My question is, and I have a dog in the fight. I'm started this career as a safety professional. So I'm curious what our thinking is about safety and well-being as a strategic culture driver. And what approaches are we seeing to govern people's well-being, especially in this COVID-19 times?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll start since Jenny seems to be taking a breath there. Trying to time this.
All right, lady, take 5.
No, it's fine. So the first question that comes into my mind is ensuring that element ties directly to the strategy. So how salient is safety and well-being in the execution of the strategy? So there's some kinds of work certainly where it's more pressing than others, I guess one would argue, and where that might come to the fore for employees being asked. And management being asked to characterize the needed culture. And then once it is a salient feature, it is also interesting to think about now with COVID is an opportunity actually for companies to demonstrate how important it is and how much they value it, how they walk the talk around the importance of employee well-being. So a couple of the companies I work with, for instance, have instituted incredibly comprehensive programs that enable very convenient, free testing that cover, various aspects of family care. Thinking creatively, obviously, about flexible work, all the things that their employees are coming back with saying, here's a strain on me, here's something I worry about around my safety and well-being, what can the company do? And these companies then, to varying degrees, either stepping in and showing their commitment or, perhaps being a little more restrained in their ability to invest there or their decision to invest. So I think this actually highlights that for those companies where it is an issue and gives management teams a chance to really step up and show that's a value that they hold.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and would just make sort of the broader point that what we know about crises like this is that whatever actions organizations take in these moments will have long-lasting impact on employee perceptions. We know that there's a big radar up right now, and members of organizations, constituents who are connected to organizations, customers, shareholders even, are watching very, very closely for how organizations respond. And what looks very convenient or relevant in the short run can often have sort of collateral long-term damage. I give one example. I know that the university is not a public company, but back in the day, University of California, where I work, we hit the recession, the last round of the recession, and the university was in a very financially challenging period as a result of that. All of California was in trouble, as was the university. And so after about a week of recognizing where the economy was, the president of the university announced that they were going to do pay cuts for faculty. And the pay cuts would actually be inverse, 10% for the highest paid faculty, 2% for the lowest paid faculty. And on the one hand, that sounds like a great idea, right? You get back a lot of money, and it seems like you're not hurting the people who have more money as much as the people who have less. But if you think about it, the University of California, from a faculty standpoint, runs on a star model, which is that the very best and brightest are employed as faculty there. And I'll tell you that it's taken 10 years since that decision to attract the best and the brightest back. And so as you're working with your management teams, your leadership teams on your boards, I think one of the most important things that you can do is try to help the teams really wrestle through shorter term decisions that are going to have longer term reverberations, and particularly around issues like layoffs and pay cuts. Those things stick with organizations for long periods of time and can have very dramatic impact that is not really apparent in the short run. So that's something that we're seeing boards being able to wrestle with. Was there one more question, Daniela? And then I think we want to show the results of that poll at some point.
Janet, if you had a comment earlier, feel free to unmute and pop in here.
Oh, sure. I just wanted to share another example about the corporate culture. And I want to use an example of one of the public companies that I've been working with for several years. In fact, I started working with them a year before they IPO'd. And I just feel like kind of their whole development has just embedded the culture. The company's product is focuses on sustainability, and ESG is such an important topic. So I've seen the company grow from about 300 employees in 5 years to 1,200 and growing. And so it's just been interesting to see how, as the company continues to grow, that it's just embedded not just with the employees, but with the suppliers and the customer base. They're just, so engaged in sustainability and carbon emission, but also doing it such that it's also considerate of the employees. And I think of what's happened since COVID. There's 7 manufacturing plants in the U.S. Service. The company, it's plants operating even through COVID, but it's done it safely, listened to the employees, taken a lot of precautions and steps in place, yet still maintaining that culture, which I think is what is helping the company to continue to grow, especially in these difficult times that we've had the last few months.
Yeah, I think that touches on another idea. I know we'll get to the results in a minute. Sorry, but it's come up a number of times, this connection to the, I should never do caveats. I hope that happens to other people. I just lost my thread. Yeah, it's the commitment to those values through, to the consistency, right? The demonstration of it, and by what you just described, it shows the strategic relevance of the culture that the company has. And that, you know, even as times get really difficult, it provides that roadmap that Jenny mentioned. And the actual thought I'm managing to arrive at is that sense that every individual employee is empowered to make good decisions that are aligned, and by understanding that roadmap. You know, so it sounds as though that's a great example of a company that's done a very good job of helping everybody understand the trade-offs and what's important to success, such that then even when a complete disruption comes along, something totally unanticipated, they still understand how to make trade-offs in the right direction and how each individual can act on a given day. And then that's one of the things I'm always trying to remind people is all of us make probably 1,000 micro decisions every day. And so the power of having those be informed and aligned is actually pretty incredible. And as an organization scales, only more important.
Yeah, so sort of back to Jim's idea about attending large, you know, gatherings of employees to really see where the culture is. You know, organizations can be weak in two different ways. One is they can be weak if there's a lot of talk about the culture, but no real backup to it, a kind of vacuous culture where there's a high level of agreement. Oh, we want to be, you know, #1 in customer service, but no real, right? The post office believes that. And, you know, so, but there's no real depth to it. The other is that you could have conflicting views of the culture, what we call warring factions, which is a dramatic name for, you know, a disagreement about what the culture is and what it should be. And both are forms of what I consider to be sort of weaker cultures. Now, it's also the case that companies like Salesforce, for example, a very strong, active culture, has by definition subcultures throughout the organization. Finance has a different culture than the software division, but there's always a connection up to the larger organizational culture. And really, a culture is what we mean by a strong culture is that there's consistency and comprehensiveness, and that's when culture really has potency in an organization, when people see consistency and comprehensiveness. And the reason is because that's when they believe the culture is real. And that's when they're willing to take a risk on behalf of upholding the culture. That's their proof point, right? That there's consistency and comprehensiveness. So when Melinda talks about, you know, even suppliers, new organizations, the organization for these things, that's the kind of consistency and comprehensiveness that leads people to believe it's real. Okay, should we? Oh, please, Kim.
I was just going to make a comment, and it might be a little bit out of bounds here in terms of the dialogue, but when you said subcultures, it reminds me of the challenge. I used to lead a very large global organization for HP, and I had a certain set of values and what I would consider a culture for my organization. You know, it's 10,000 people, 15,000 if you include contractors all over the world. And what was really interesting was there was the actual culture of the country and the location that had its own, you know, norms that is part of that culture. And then there's the culture of the company. And we had a lot of challenges in, you know, certain cultures don't like to come right out and say no, and other cultures. And so how we kind of had to weave our communication and the culture of the entire organization. It was fascinating and I loved it. It was one of my favorite things that in my career, but it certainly is challenging. And I don't know if that, I know when you're talking about culture, it sounds like when you say finance and different groups, obviously, even those, I understand the different cultures, but then you weave in between that, the actual cultures of the different communities. And it's really fascinating, very interesting.
Well, and I also,
the best of all those together, it turns into a very huge strategic advantage, you know, but it takes time and it takes a lot of energy. And what's really ironic is we did everything virtually because we had to by nature of the organization. But we had certain things we did, like if we had the funding, we'd meet at least 2 to 3 times a year. And we didn't have funding to do that, we'd meet once a year. And it made a huge difference that 1 week in bonding the people together culturally for the organization. So anyways, just.
It's
I
super
also,
interesting.
oh,
Go ahead.
Sorry. I also think that it's not just like the international, I think that's a great example, but episodic events in the world or in like what we're going through right now have a tremendous effect on people's perception of the culture. And what I'm hearing from some of the companies that I advise is when we first went into the whole COVID lockdown, that people were saying, oh my goodness, there are no boundaries. My boss is texting me and calling me just because I'm working from home at all these various different hours. And when I was working in the office, we had this culture that there was balance. There was the family life and there was your work life and there was a contribution and all the kinds of things that make for a great culture. And they kind of went out the window at the beginning. And then we saw, as COVID looks like it's going to be around for a while, CEOs making conscious decisions to get back to that work balance. One of my companies that I'm on the board of, when the schools continued to be locked down, but the employees were able to go back to work, he put in a room for parents who had children working and brought in a tutor or a teacher to help them with their remote learning on the campus of the environment if the parents wanted to do that. And that was really appreciated from a cultural perspective, that you really value me as a person and you take my mental, stress level down by helping me cope with this environment. So I think this situation we're in right now has represented both opportunities and also highlighted some of the challenges that cultures have. I think it's gone both ways.
Yeah, the main thing we're seeing in the research on how cultures are changing during COVID, and this is, from March until now, I think we're in, a phase. I think we're probably in I think there was a first phase that was sort of shock and reaction, and now we're in a more of a habituated phase. But the main shift that was associated with members of organizations finding more silver linings than dark clouds in the pandemic, the main determinant of that was whether the culture shifted to be a little bit less performance oriented and hard driving and a little bit more supportive of employees. I mean, that's not rocket science. That's an obvious finding. And I know organizations can't do that forever, but I do believe that this exogenous shock, right? This thing that has happened to all of us. I do believe that it's going to drive a real change in work and in long-term work. I'm here near the Silicon Valley, and all of those firms are very much investing in remote work and projecting that remote work will be something that will be here for quite some time. And I think organizations are going to get much, much more deliberate about when people need to actually be together in person and when don't. I think real estate is going to be rethought. I think commuting is going to be rethought. I think traveling for business is going to be rethought in very, very significant ways. So should we show what do you think, Jennifer? Should we show the results of the poll of involvement in culture from a board perspective? Moderately involved. Yeah. So I think we're interested in finding out what that involvement looks like. What are some examples of ways that you all have tracked the culture or gathered information about it? What are some of the questions that you still have about the culture and would like to know more about?
And from Zashan in the chat, how can positive culture be continuously endangered in a systemic and interwoven way? So if you want to go ahead and unmute and add on to your question and pop in the conversation here, we'd love to hear from you.
All right, engendered, not endangered. Thank you. Yeah, so it's really, I think measurement aside for a minute, that can be measured. Let's just say that the recognition is there for the culture having a need. And in this case, I'm actually referring to an organization that has had years of mistrust and so on. The CEO has recognized their role into this. The board has recognized that there needs to be changes. So how can it be done in a systemic way, interwoven into the processes, the daily doings, and in the hiring and the D&I practices, just going forward? You know, keep looking at the rear mirror doesn't necessarily give a lot of comfort. I think it just raises anxiety.
Yeah, I can comment on that a bit, just because that's essentially what I've tried to do in certain settings, different circumstances, but really, how do you do a systematic approach to a shift, if I hear your question right? And first question is, that one would have to ask is the CEO aligned to the future state? I mean, is this someone who can engender trust and who is on board with the need for change? And you're nodding, so that's really good news.
Well, no, they're not, but they're going to step down,
Okay.
and a new CEO will arrive.
There you go. So new leader is a very good way to turn the page. That'll help a ton for the credibility that things are actually going to change. But then what I would say is when we did this in the case that Jenny wrote about, for instance, there was no playbook, there was no map. We just made it up. We literally just sat together and made things up for how do we affect systemic behavior, but we did it using these levers of culture that you can identify very easily and know about. And you've just mentioned some of them, which are communication, rewards and recognition, recruiting and retaining, et cetera, performance management. So there are very explicit activities that every business engages in that you can use as levers of culture change. And if you systematically walk through each one and say, how shall we approach X? So that we move in a direction of more trust, more transparency, or whatever features people have really asked for. I can give you an example there. If we go to transparency, for instance, we did have some room to grow around what was actually categorized under integrity. But as we peeled the onion and tried to learn what did that mean, because that's a big word with a lot in it, what we learned was that employees were asking for more transparency. They felt like a lot of decisions had been made in a black box in the past, and that eroded trust, somewhat aligned to what you're describing. So an example came up, and this also goes to that having a roadmap being extremely helpful, where we were about to need to consolidate 2 sales forces. That was going to be a massive reorg, affect virtually every rep in the area, in that therapeutic area, in a pretty profound way. But we were partnered on the product. The partner had agreed to the reorg, and then at the very last minute, they changed their minds. Now, we had already just brought together the whole field management team, dozens of people, to roll this out to them. And there they were. And we found out that the partner was now saying we couldn't do it. So our decision was, do we turn this meeting into something else and just tell them something else and deal with this behind the scenes? Or do we bring them into the tent, which is the mess of the sausage making right now, trust them with this, that they won't, spread it inappropriately and alarm people, but bring them into that discussion of a major shift. It wasn't easy to do, but it was easy to decide, because we knew we had promised transparency. That's what they needed. That meant we tell them. They're just, we had that discussion at just a couple senior folks that knew, and we said, no, we have to tell them. That's what we've committed to do. So having that kind of, here's what we want to look like, and here are all the places that we can demonstrate it, it really allows you to be much more systematic and consistent. And by having it widely held, widely shared, you find that everybody else can be your helper. You, as the single leader, the CEO in that case, or his management team, her management team, or a board member, don't have to be the police of the culture, because everybody in the whole organization actually owns it, cares about it, and will reinforce it, and feel empowered to raise their hand if they see it being violated. So all of those things actually give you great momentum to make a change faster. As Jenny described, we actually did manage to shift these behaviors in a relatively short period of time. It was 600 people spread across the country, not in the same building. And yet, we were able to create change through this really systematic and consistent approach.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just to highlight the levers that Jennifer mentioned, those are the keys: who you hire, how you socialize, develop, train, orient them, how you communicate with people, how you reward them, both formally and informally, what you celebrate, what the informal rewards are, and how leaders behave. Those are the primary levers for cultivating an effective culture or changing a culture. And, those are massive buckets under which multiple practices can exist. We've gone through a culture change process in the business school at Haas, and at last count, our culture was literally embedded into 180 different practices. So, right, we're talking about weaving in this prioritization in a way that is consistent and comprehensive.
So we have an example and a question from Melinda. Melinda, feel free to hop in here.
Yeah, hi, it's Melinda Franklin, United Airlines, and thanks for your examples using Southwest, because similarly we have in our DNA since January of 2018, safety, caring, dependability, and efficiency as our core 4 values. Now the hard part is during this time since COVID, and now literally today, we are on the brink of letting go of permanently 16,000 employees. The industry as a whole tomorrow could be letting go as many as 80,000, 90,000 employees across the board. So it's a very difficult time, difficult in general, this whole process. I received a call today, which was great, from our executive chairman, our former CEO, Oscar Munoz. And we chatted for about 15 minutes just about some of the things I'm seeing on the West Coast. And, you know, I think the hard thing is how you, and you addressed this a bit, Jenny, about how with such a huge hit, how you can bring that culture back to where we're striving for since January 2018, you know, and continue to incorporate within our plans moving forward. But it's so demoralizing for all of us to go through this. I had to have my final conversation with my assistant today, and she's gone. So, you know, I'm just in this odd state and trying to make sense of it, and as a leader in the company, trying to figure out how to move forward and to keep that positive culture on the areas I mentioned, safety, caring, dependability, and efficiency, authentic and real. And just want to seek your thoughts and advice on that.
Yeah, that's an extremely difficult situation. You know, I think there's no rocket science to this. I'm sure I'm not going to say anything that hasn't already occurred to you, but you know, what people want to see in this kind of a situation is first that that there's evidence that you've looked for multiple solutions, that you've tried to avoid this in every possible way that you can, and that you've invested extensively in finding other solutions and thinking of other things that could be done. And people really want to know that you've been serious about that. And then second, people want to ensure that the people that are let go are treated respectfully and fairly, right? I mean, this is you know, a basic human expectation. And then that as soon as it happens, the people that are surviving, right, who are staying, need to have an understanding of what's expected of them and what's going to need to happen in order for the organization to be successful moving forward. So, you know, those 3 things I know you've thought about very, very extensively, but from a psychological perspective, that's what people are looking for. The only, you know, sort of slight advantage, and I say that word, you know, with great ambivalence, is that this is an unprecedented situation. And, you know, I think that there is some understanding of the vastness of the challenge that we have in front of us. And so, you know, I think people have that cognition. That doesn't reduce your responsibility of treating people as well as possible and ensuring that you've looked for other solutions. There are many more experts in this room than me on such a topic, but are there other thoughts to offer, Melinda, here?
Jennifer, I had a question on this one, and I think it's related. I did raise your paper on part what you contributed to culture and social control, corporations, cult, and commitment. So when you were speaking this, right, kind of dawned upon me is a personal goal that somebody has for in their life and what they recognize them as. If it's too intrinsically linked to, here's where the cult piece comes in, to just a corporation, then you're pretty broken when something like this happens, because your identity is broken into pieces, right? But that seems to me is more like a cult-like cultural indoctrination rather than a culture of growth and development. And if you're not here today, then you're somewhere else, kind of a thing. So I don't have formative thoughts about it. I haven't read the whole paper, but I wanted to bring that point up and just kind of hear, the healthy version of the culture, not the cult version of the culture, where individuals are broken once they're de-linked from the corporate identity.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. No, that's actually a really interesting question that I hadn't really thought of that way. Yeah, I mean, I think that the bigger issue, the bigger question about avoiding your culture becoming a cult is really about that third criterion, that the culture is adaptable over time and that you don't get stuck by inertia. So one kernel that I'll leave you with, we did a study of 60 of the largest publicly traded high technology firms over a 6-year period. These firms together control about $1 trillion in the gross national product of the US. And we measured both the strength of their culture, how strong it was, but also how adaptable the culture was over time. And what we found was that the cultures in these firms, the organizations that had cultures that were stronger and more adaptive did the best. But interestingly, the ones that were weaker and less adaptive were not the ones that did the worst. The ones that did the worst were strong cultures that didn't emphasize adaptability. These were organizations that ran on inertia, essentially. And the difference between the strong cultures that were adaptable and those that were strong but not adaptable was about 15% in annual revenue, or about $5 billion. So for any of your leadership teams or colleagues who don't think that culture matters on the bottom line, this was actually a published research study that shows the financial value of getting the culture right. And adaptability is essential to ensure that you don't just start turning inward and not being adaptive to external changes. And part of Melinda's challenge is explaining this very drastic change that the organization has had to make to adapt to a new reality out there in the external world. And I think explaining it in strategic terms is vital, but also explaining it in human terms and how much, sadness and ambivalence the organization has about that is a reasonable thing to do under the circumstances. So
I wanted to. Oh, sorry. I had a thought though about the difficulty that you're. I mean, that's just an incredible experience, and I'm sorry that it's having to happen, of course. And as the next steps, as you think about, I just want to be sure that the culture piece remains an asset for you and an organizational support and not a liability. And by that, I mean, it might be worth, if there's a way, I can't imagine the scale that you're dealing with, but if there's a way to enable the remaining employees to actually weigh in on those cultural attributes that you described, and whether they still feel valid, whether they're being upheld through the change, and whether they're still the right ones going forward, given the changes in the world right now for your industry are extremely dramatic. So it could be a chance once and there is that kind of chapter-like movement to this that I think probably all of us have been through, where there's the very difficult middle where you're still losing people and having those conversations. There's a lot of grief that just has to be processed. But once you are turning the page and saying, okay, we're the survivors now, we're the team going forward, who do we want to be? How will we define our future? How will we define our success? That actually can be quite inspiring and motivating, and you can come out of a dip like this with either a burden that holds you back or a sense of renewed energy and commitment and drive that can actually take you way beyond where you might have gone before. So it feels like there's a chance there to maybe engage people in that dialogue around those 4 things rather than just reinforce them, which might be one angle, is to say, but our culture is still the same. That might not land very credibly. Or you just want to know, does it land right? Are these still the same things, in which case we'll commit to doubling down? It feels like a really good opportunity to actually engage people when the time is right, with the who do we want to be in the future kind of discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Actually, I'll throw out another one. I think is also because it is such an industry-wide, problem and hit. If also people, not only your current employees, but folks leaving, may be looking, how is Delta, how is American, how are all the airlines doing it, and are they being treated better or differently than United? And, it's such a small community. People look around and go, wait a minute, look how our folks got treated, yet the other airlines treated their people much better. So that's also something maybe to keep on the radar.
Yeah, I think we're all looking at best practices of each other, and we're all in different cash positions, obviously. But I think that, it's just, my question really was just how, moving forward, how do we evolve? And I think Jennifer answered that question well. And I saw John Hoda's comment, we're not the only ones, obviously. We're just a representative example of what's happening in the world as we speak. So it's just, you want to be positive and optimistic, but just seeing the devastation to your coworkers is extremely challenging, and with no end in sight. I think if people felt there was a light at the end of the tunnel, that would give us some hope and optimism. But right now it's not there. But thank you everyone for your responses.
So Lisa, I wanted to do a time check. Are we?
Well, I think that it would be maybe possible to, we've got until 2:40, and so we're doing well. I'd like Kim to make some closing remarks, but if you two had some kind of closing thoughts on this, that would be great. Do Daniela,
Sure.
you want to weigh in on this too in terms of timing?
We have 7 minutes left, so I'd love to hear kind of main takeaways from our facilitators.
That would be great. Yeah, if you could kind of, if you have another question you want to ask our directors, that's fine too. But this would be a great time to kind of hear some of your key takeaways from this as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here and then hand it to you, Jenny, to close. I think that last discussion we just had for me is actually a really powerful example and reminder of the importance of culture and the ways that we can use it as leaders to heal the organization when it needs it, and also to drive for success when that's what we have, as an opportunity directly in front of us. And the thing that I've really learned is that the culture and doing the work is actually a catalyst to inclusion. It's a way to bring everyone into the tent, to have them feel like they're a part of the organization, to gain their wisdom for real, not just to ask, for the sake of looking inclusive, but really to gain the wisdom of the many, rather than relying on only the experience of the few that are kind of anointed at the top. And I think it's a very manageable, tractable, and important way to engage broad organizations in any array of issues that may actually come up. It shifts the accountabilities for shaping the organization in the future to a much broader team, as we just talked about, no matter what the circumstance. And I find the power in that to be really very compelling and worth considering in almost every situation. How can culture help us here? How can reaching out and engaging our people and shaping our future culture really get us through this moment, whatever this moment may be? And obviously, a lot of really, really challenging moments occurring for companies and individuals now. So it's a way to help us.
Yeah, I think you summed that up really well, Jennifer. And I think all I would add is, as board members, I think it's an important time to help senior teams really put the culture into focus and ask the question, who do we want to be as we come out of this? And what do we want to be known for? And how can we ensure that our good intentions are actually felt throughout the organization. And you know, it often means over communicating, increasing transparency at a time when we're actually restricted from some of the most vibrant forms of communication, which is in-person versions. But I would really encourage your boards to encourage your management teams to be thinking hard about the imprint of their culture right now and how they can ensure that the organization is cohesively making its way through the very, very difficult time. And you know, again, remembering strategically relevant, strong, adaptive over time, thinking about those levers that you have available to you, who you hire, how you develop people over time, how you reward them, and how you behave as leaders. I love the story about the CEO who showed the chaos that was going on, you know, in the back of his Zoom, right? That it shows that he too is experiencing some of the challenges that employees are undoubtedly facing throughout the organization. So I think these tools are what allows an organization to show people that it's serious about its culture, and that culture has some coherence to it. It has a level of consistency to it, and therefore it has some strength and identification for possibilities for it. So I think boards are important in this way. And, you know, as usual, we don't tell management teams what to do, but we ask those questions and see what the answers are and try to help leaders make it a priority. So thank you all. It's really been a pleasure to meet with you. These are really great questions, comments. I've learned a lot.
Well, thank you. Thank you to both of our panelists today, Jennifer and Jenny. You know, great topic. And, you know, it's not even one angle. It's not just the pandemic or just the social, you know, unrest or just the leadership of our country, or it's just so many different things that I think now more than ever, the board's role in understanding, not to micromanage, but to understand that it's being thoughtful and that it's being taken care of and that it's evolving with the times. I think we're all in some ways in uncharted territories. There's always been downturns in the economy and different things, but never this, you know, screeching, you know, free fall that we've all been experiencing. So I appreciate everyone that's come on the call to have the dialogue and open conversation. And also, if you could fill out the surveys, we really do treasure your feedback so we can make sure we're as effective as we can be with what we're bringing to you and what could help you as stewards of the boards that you're on. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and close it out and thank everybody for coming. And again, thank you to our panelists and everyone that's come here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everybody. Really great to see you all. Really appreciate you being here.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.